There is a moment in every person's life when the ground beneath them shifts, when everything they believe to be solid turns out to be something else entirely, when the faces they have known for years suddenly look different in the light. This story is about one of those moments. Except this time, the woman at the center of it did not collapse. She did not beg. She did not wait to be rescued. She vanished. And what she'd built in the silence of her disappearance was something that nobody who underestimated her ever saw coming. Her name is Victoria Hargrove. And by the time you finish watching this video, you will understand why what she did was not desperate, not reckless, and not the action of a woman who had run out of options. It was the most calculated, the most precise, and arguably the most brilliant decision she ever made. A decision that saved everything her father built, exposed the people who tried to take it from her, and changed the course of her life permanently. This is her story, told in full, and it begins not with a courtroom, not with a confrontation, but with a Tuesday evening in November, a hallway, and a phone call she was never supposed to hear. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what Victoria Hargrove eventually did and why she did it, you have to understand where she came from. Not in the abstract, inspirational sense that people mean when they say things like she came from humble beginnings. You have to understand it in the specific, concrete, structural sense. Because what happened to Victoria was inseparable from what was being taken from her. And to know what was at stake, you have to know what her father built and what he meant by building it. Thomas Hargrove was not a man who inherited wealth. He was born in a mid-sized city in South America, the son of a factory worker and a school dinner lady, and he grew up understanding very clearly that nobody was going to hand him anything. He was sharp, mathematically gifted, intensely observant, and he had a particular talent for seeing opportunity in places other people had written off as ordinary. He started working at 14, saved aggressively, and by the time he was in his early 30s, he had quietly accumulated enough capital to buy his first commercial property. A small, unremarkable warehouse on the edge of an industrial district that everyone else considered too risky. Thomas Hargrove considered it a beginning. Over the next 2 decades, that beginning became Hargrove Capital Group, a mid-sized but extremely solid property and asset management firm with a portfolio that spanned commercial real estate, residential developments, and a growing arm in asset consulting that had attracted some of the most respected institutional clients in the region. Thomas did not chase headlines. He did not seek publicity. He built slowly, deliberately, and with an almost obsessive attention to the kind of detail that protected his clients and protected his reputation. By the time his name was well known in the industry, he had already made most of his most important decisions. And one of the most important of all was the decision he made about his daughter. Victoria was Thomas Hargrove's only child. Her mother, a woman named Eleanor, had passed away when Victoria was 11 years old after a long-term illness, and from that point forward, Thomas had raised his daughter alone. He had not done it by keeping her at a distance from his work. On the contrary, he had done it by bringing her in. By the time Victoria was 8 years old, she was sitting in her father's office on Saturday mornings, watching him review contracts, take calls from developers, negotiate terms with people twice his age. She was not a passive observer. Thomas Hargrove made sure of that. He would explain what he was doing as he was doing it. He would ask her questions. He would ask her what she had noticed. And she noticed everything. This was not a typical childhood. Victoria understood that, even as a young girl, her friends were at birthday parties and sleepovers, and she was sometimes at those things too, but she was also, from a very early age, someone who understood what it meant to own something, what it meant to build something, what it meant to be responsible for a thing that other people depended on. Her father never framed it as a burden. He framed it as a privilege. And Victoria absorbed that framing completely. She went to university, studied business and law, graduated with honors, and spent 2 years working at a firm that had nothing to do with her father's company. Thomas had insisted on that. He wanted her to develop her own professional identity before she came to work with him. He wanted her to know, without question, that she had earned her place. She joined Hargrove Capital Group at 26, starting in client relations, moving to operations, then to strategy, and by the time she was 32, she was deputy director. Not because her last name was Hargrove, although there were always people who assumed that, but because she was exceptionally good at her job, because she understood the business at every level, and because the clients and the staff who worked with her trusted her in the way that people only trust someone who consistently proves they are worth trusting. Thomas Hargrove died 4 years before this story reaches its most dramatic point. He was 67 years old. He had not retired, had no plans to retire, and died of a sudden cardiac event on a Wednesday morning while he was preparing for a board meeting. It was completely unexpected. The grief for Victoria was immense, and it was complicated by the fact that she had not only lost a father. She had lost a partner, a mentor, the person who had shaped not just her career but her entire understanding of what it meant to move through the world with integrity and purpose. In his will, Thomas Hargrove left Hargrove Capital Group to Victoria. In its entirety, unconditionally. He had written a personal letter, separate from the legal documents, that she received on the morning of the reading of the will. It was 2 pages long. She has never shared its full contents publicly, but she has spoken about a single line that she has returned to hundreds of times since. Her father wrote, "You are ready. You have always been ready. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." She read that line standing in a solicitor's office on a gray Thursday morning, 11 days after her father's funeral, and she did not cry. She folded the letter carefully, put it in her bag, and walked out to run the company he had left her. What she did not know yet was that 2 people already in her life had read the situation very differently. They had not seen a grieving daughter stepping into her father's shoes. They had seen a window. Victoria had met her husband, Marcus, at a charity event approximately 7 years before her father died. He was 41 at the time, worked in private equity, and had the kind of social ease that made rooms feel smaller in a comfortable way. He was articulate, financially literate, and he had a quality that Victoria, reflecting later, identified as the ability to seem like the most interested person in any conversation. He asked good questions. He remembered details. He made people feel seen. In retrospect, and with everything she now knows, Victoria understands that these qualities were not incidental. They were professional. Marcus had spent his entire career reading people and figuring out what they wanted to be told. Thomas Hargrove had met Marcus twice before he died and had said in private that he seemed like a capable man. Not an enthusiastic endorsement, but not a warning either. Victoria had taken it as a green light. She had wanted her father to like Marcus, and she had interpreted qualified approval as genuine warmth. This is one of the things she has spoken about honestly when she reflects on the period before everything unraveled. She was grieving during a significant portion of her marriage. First, the anticipatory grief of watching her father's health occasionally falter, and then the acute grief of losing him. And grief, she has said, can function like a kind of fog. It does not change the facts around you, but it changes how clearly you can see them. And for several years, Victoria was not seeing Marcus clearly. Marcus had, from the very beginning of their relationship, shown a particular interest in the operational and structural details of Hargrove Capital Group. He framed this as support, as engagement, as the behavior of a man who wanted to understand his partner's world. He asked questions about the company's board composition, about the founding charter, about the terms under which the directorship could change hands, about the composition of the asset portfolio and how it was held. At the time, Victoria interpreted these questions as curiosity. The natural curiosity of an intelligent man who worked in finance and found business structures inherently interesting. She answered them thoroughly. Over years of dinners and weekend conversations and evenings on the sofa with glasses of wine, she answered nearly every question Marcus ever put to her about the inner workings of her father's company. What she did not know was that those answers were being catalogued. Not in any written record that could be discovered, but in the organized, methodical mind of a man who was, the whole time, constructing a picture. A map, essentially. A map of Hargrove Capital Group that identified every structural vulnerability, every legal mechanism that could be invoked under the right circumstances, and every relationship on the board that might, with the right cultivation, be leveraged in a particular direction. Marcus had also, during the 3 years following Thomas Hargrove's death, developed a significant relationship with the company's general manager, a man named Clifford Beaumont. Clifford was 54, had been with the firm for 17 years, and had been passed over for the director position not once but twice during Thomas Hargrove's tenure. The first time when Thomas had brought in an external candidate at a pivotal moment of company growth, and the second time when Thomas had, without any ambiguity, chosen Victoria as his successor. Clifford had handled both occasions with professional composure. He had shaken hands and said the right things and continued to perform his role competently. But 17 years of loyalty and 2 decisive rejections leave a mark on a person. They leave a particular kind of residue that, under the right conditions and with the right encouragement, can become something else. Marcus had found Clifford Beaumont at a company event 18 months after Thomas Hargrove's death. They had spoken first in a perfectly ordinary way, the way people speak at professional gatherings. But Marcus was skilled at finding the weight in a conversation. The thing a person is carrying that they are not saying out loud. And in Clifford Beaumont, Marcus found a man who believed, with a quiet and long-held conviction, that the company should have been his. Not out of greed, exactly. Out of a sense of deserving. A sense that years of service and institutional knowledge and hard work had entitled him to something that had been given, instead, to a woman whose primary qualification, in his view, was that she shared her father's surname. That belief, which Clifford had never openly expressed to anyone inside the company, became the foundation of everything that followed. Marcus cultivated it carefully. He did not rush. He did not make direct proposals in the early stages. He listened. He validated. He occasionally floated hypothetical framings, conversations about what the company might look like under different leadership, about whether certain board relationships might be open to a different kind of conversation, about what the founding charter actually permitted in specific circumstances. They were, in Marcus's framing, intellectual discussions, strategic musings between 2 men who knew the business world well. But they were building toward something. And by the time Victoria stood in that hallway on a Tuesday evening in November and heard what she heard, the building had been going on for a long time. It is important to understand the ordinary texture of the evening on which Victoria Hargrove's understanding of her own life was permanently altered. It was not a dramatic evening by any external measure. A Tuesday in late November. Victoria had been at a meeting that had been scheduled to run until 7 in the evening, but the client had cancelled at short notice, and the meeting had ended before 5. She had decided to go home. She had not messaged Marcus to say she was coming. There was no particular reason to. She lived there. She drove home, pulled into the garage, came in through the back door of the house, and set her bag down in the kitchen. The house was quiet. Then she heard voices from Marcus's study, a room at the end of the first-floor corridor that Marcus used for private calls and personal work. The door was slightly ajar, and the voice coming through the gap was unmistakably Clifford Beaumont's. She recognized it immediately. She had heard that voice in board meetings and company functions and end-of-year reviews for years. There was nothing alarming about hearing it at first. Marcus and Clifford knew each other. They had been at various company events together. She assumed it was a call about something work-related, something peripheral, and she moved toward the kitchen to make herself tea. But something made her stop. Something she has described as an instinct she cannot fully articulate. A quality in the tone of the conversation that was not the quality of a casual professional call. She stopped. She stood completely still in the hallway. And she listened. What she heard in the next 4 minutes and 11 seconds, she counted afterwards when she could think again, was the detailed discussion of a plan that had clearly been in development for a significant period of time. Marcus and Clifford were speaking with the fluency of two people who had had this conversation, or versions of this conversation, many times before. There was no hesitation, no explanation of terms to each other, no catching up on background. They were in the middle of something. And what they were in the middle of was the final stage of a scheme to remove Victoria Hargrove from her own company. The mechanism was precise and had been constructed with legal advice from a solicitor whose name Victoria did not recognize, which told her immediately that this was someone engaged independently and deliberately outside her professional circle. The plan centered on a provision in Hargrove Capital Group's founding charter, a document that dated back to the company's original incorporation and that Victoria, in the demanding years since her father's death, had not reviewed in full. The provision allowed for a vote of no confidence in the sitting director under a specific set of conditions. It required a qualified majority of the board, and it required the formal support of the general manager. Clifford had the board relationships. He had spent 17 years cultivating them. Marcus had, quietly and without Victoria's knowledge, met individually with 4 of the 7 board members in the preceding 8 months. He had not made explicit proposals in those meetings. He had done something more effective. He had planted seeds. He had positioned himself as a concerned voice, a man who cared about the company's future, a man who had noticed, as a close observer, certain areas of concern in the current leadership. He had not named Victoria directly. He had not needed to. At the same time, Marcus had been consulting a specialist in marital asset law. His own marriage to Victoria and his status as her legal spouse gave him a potential claim on a portion of the company's value under the terms of their state's equitable distribution laws in the event of a divorce or legal separation. He had spent months understanding precisely what that entailed. What a divorce initiated at a strategic moment, combined with a no-confidence vote at the same moment, would look like in legal terms. The simultaneous pressure on 2 fronts. Victoria fighting a board challenge while simultaneously navigating a marital asset claim would, in Marcus's calculation, be unsustainable. She would not have the resources, the focus, or the emotional capacity to fight both at the same time. She would lose at least one. And losing one in the structure of the plan would cause her to lose both. The timeline they were discussing that evening was 6 weeks. They were planning to move in 6 weeks. The board had been prepared. The solicitor had finalized the paperwork. Clifford was confident he had the votes. And Marcus. And this is the moment Victoria has returned to more than any other when she has spoken about that evening. Marcus laughed. The easy, familiar laugh she had heard hundreds of times in their marriage. And he said, in the relaxed and certain tone of a man who considers something already done, "She will never see it coming." Victoria stood in that hallway for a very long time after the call ended. She did not move. She has said that during those minutes she experienced something she can only describe as a complete reconfiguration. Not a breakdown, not panic, but a rapid, almost mechanical process of recataloguing every memory, every conversation, every small inconsistency she had ever half noticed and set aside, and understanding, one by one, what each of them had actually meant. The questions about the charter. The evenings Marcus had spent with Clifford Beaumont at functions that she had not attended. The way Marcus had, on 3 separate occasions in the past year, casually suggested that she might be taking on too much, that the pressure of running the firm might not be good for her in the long term. She had taken these as care. She now understood them as the preparation of a narrative that would be useful in the weeks ahead. She did not walk into that room. She has been asked many times why she didn't, and her answer is always the same. Because walking in would have been the last useful thing she did. Marcus would have denied everything. Clifford would have been warned. The paperwork would have been accelerated. The plan would have shifted. And she would have been fighting it blind, with no preparation, no legal structure, and no advantage whatsoever. Instead, Victoria Hargrove walked quietly back to the kitchen, picked up her keys, and drove to a petrol station 2 miles from her house. She sat in the car park for 40 minutes. And by the time she drove back home, She had made a decision that, from the outside, looked like the end of everything but was, in reality, the beginning of the only move available to her that could actually work. The first person Victoria called was her closest friend, a woman named Adrienne Cole. Adrienne was a corporate litigation attorney who had been Victoria's closest friend since university, and the call came from a payphone at the petrol station because Victoria had already understood, by that point, that her personal phone was a liability. She told Adrienne everything, not in a state of distress, which is what Adrienne expected, in a methodical, detailed, sequential account that sounded, to Adrienne's ear, like a client briefing. When Victoria finished speaking, Adrienne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need 24 hours. Don't do anything. Don't change anything. Go home, behave exactly as you have been behaving, and wait for my call." Those 24 hours were among the hardest of Victoria's life. She went home. Marcus was in the kitchen making dinner when she arrived, and he greeted her with the same warmth he always used, asked about her day, opened a bottle of wine. She sat across from him at the table they had shared for 11 years, and she ate the meal he had cooked, and she spoke about ordinary things, and she watched him with a clarity she had never had before. She was looking at a man she had loved and being forced, in real time, to understand that the love had been one-directional for a very long time. Perhaps from the beginning. She did not know then, and she is not sure she will ever fully know. But she sat at that table and she smiled and she talked about whether they needed to resurface the driveway, and she held everything else in a part of herself that Marcus could not access. And she waited. Adrienne called the next morning from a new number. She had spent the previous evening consulting a colleague, a barrister named Gerald Whitmore who specialized in corporate governance and fiduciary law and who had, in his 30-year career, seen multiple cases involving exactly the kind of charter exploitation that Victoria had described. Gerald's assessment, delivered to Adrienne and then to Victoria in a secure three-way call, was both encouraging and sobering. The legal case against Marcus and Clifford was buildable. The combination of Marcus's consultations with board members, Clifford's breach of his fiduciary duty as general manager, and the use of a spousal legal claim as a strategic weapon in a corporate takeover constituted a set of potential violations significant enough to form the basis of a strong action. But it would take time. Several months of documentation, deposition preparation, and board communication. And during that time, Marcus and Clifford were going to move. 6 weeks, Victoria had said. Gerald's response was direct. 6 weeks is not enough time to build this case. We need a way to delay them. It was Adrienne who first raised the possibility of disappearance. Not in those words, not initially. She raised it as a legal question. What happens to a no-confidence vote if the sitting director is not available? What happens to a marital asset claim if the spouse's whereabouts are unknown and the matter is under investigation? Gerald answered both questions carefully. A vote of no confidence in an absent director, in the circumstances described in the Hargrove Capital Charter, would trigger a legal freeze on any significant structural changes while the situation was investigated. A marital asset claim required the active participation of both parties and could not be progressed unilaterally. An absence, particularly one accompanied by the suggestion of an accident, would not only halt Marcus and Clifford's timeline. It would freeze the entire situation in place, potentially for months, while creating a legal environment in which any aggressive move by either man would look, to any future court, extraordinarily suspicious. Victoria asked how they would make it credible. Gerald said that credibility required 3 things. A genuine departure, meaning she would need to actually leave and stay gone, without using any device or account or contact that could be traced to her current location. A plausible circumstance, meaning some event or suggestion of an event that would explain her absence without requiring official confirmation of anything. And an information firewall, meaning absolutely no contact with anyone who is not within the core legal team. No family, no colleagues, no friends outside Adrienne. The difficulty of this third requirement, Gerald said, should not be underestimated. It would require Victoria to be genuinely, completely, and indefinitely unreachable to the people she loved, as well as to the people who were trying to take everything from her. Victoria agreed to all three conditions without hesitation. She went home that evening, and for the following 6 weeks she maintained, with perfect composure, exactly the same surface life she had always lived. She attended board meetings. She reviewed contracts. She had dinner with Marcus 3 or 4 evenings a week. She did not alter her behavior in any way that could be noticed or remembered. But in the margins of that life, in the early mornings before Marcus was awake and in the long lunch breaks she started taking alone, she was building something else entirely. With Adrian and Gerald, she was documenting everything she could remember of the conversations Marcus had conducted with board members over the preceding months. She was identifying the financial trail of Marcus's independent legal consultations, which Adrienne's team found through careful examination of accessible records. She was compiling, from memory and from files she had legitimate access to in her capacity as director, a comprehensive record of Clifford Beaumont's relationships with each board member and the specific nature of those relationships. She was also, quietly, securing the company's most critical assets. Not moving them, not restructuring anything that would attract attention, but ensuring that the documentation of ownership, of provenance of the legal chain of title, was in order and in a form that could be produced rapidly if required. Her father had been meticulous in his record-keeping, and what Victoria discovered during this period was that Thomas Hargrove had, years before his death, taken certain protective steps in the company's structure that Marcus and Clifford had either not found or had discounted. Steps that would prove significant. She catalogued all of it, and she passed it, piece by piece, through the firewall to Adrian and Gerald. On a Friday evening in late January, 6 weeks to the day after she had stood in that hallway, Victoria Hargrove came home, cooked dinner, ate with Marcus, watched an hour of television with him, said she was tired, went to bed, and waited until the house was quiet. She had packed a single bag 3 days earlier, a bag that had been in the boot of a second car she kept at the office, a car Marcus did not use and rarely noticed. At 2 a.m, she got up, dressed, left her personal phone on the nightstand, and walked out of the house. She drove to a location Adrian had arranged, left the car at a pre-agreed point, was met by a contact who drove her to a property Adrian held in her own name in a different state. And she disappeared. She left one message. It was on her phone, set to send the following morning, and it went to Marcus. It said, simply, "Gone for a few days. Don't worry." She had debated whether to leave anything at all. In the end, Adrian had advised it. An absence with no message at all triggers immediate contact with authorities. A vague, ordinary message buys time. It makes the absence look like a choice rather than a crisis. And in the space between a choice and a crisis, Adrian had explained, there is a great deal of room for a story to form. The story that formed over the following days and weeks, fed quietly and carefully by Adrian through the right channels, was that Victoria Hargrove had been involved in a serious road accident in a remote area while traveling. That emergency services had attended, but that there were no confirmed survivors, and that the investigation was ongoing. It was not a confirmed death. It did not need to be. It was an uncertainty. And uncertainty, in legal and corporate terms, is a powerful thing. The property Adrian had arranged was a small, well-maintained house in a quiet residential area, the kind of place that attracts no attention whatsoever because it is simply ordinary. Victoria had a secure laptop, a series of encrypted communication lines to Adrian and Gerald, and cash for all her immediate needs. She had no credit cards, no phone registered in her name, no social media presence, and no contact with anyone outside the legal team. She had also, before she left, transferred the care of several personal matters to Adrian, whose name Victoria had held on certain documents as an emergency contact for years. Everything was covered. And then, for the first time in a very long time, Victoria Hargrove stopped moving and started thinking. The first 2 weeks were the most difficult. Not because of fear, not because of physical hardship, but because of the particular agony of enforced stillness for a person who had been in motion, professionally and personally, for her entire adult life. She slept badly. She went through periods of intense anger, not the hot, unfocused anger of someone who has been blindsided, but the cold, clarifying anger of someone who has reviewed the evidence thoroughly and arrived at an unambiguous conclusion. She was angry at Marcus. She was angry at Clifford. She was angry at herself for the questions she had not asked and the signs she had not followed. And then, sometime in the third week, the anger settled into something more useful. It settled into focus. She spent those months working at a level she had rarely reached even in the most demanding periods of her professional life. Every morning, she was at the laptop by 6, reviewing documents, preparing briefs, answering Gerald's questions with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years learning every detail of the company she ran. Gerald's team was building the legal case simultaneously, and the material Victoria was providing from the cottage was its backbone. Clifford's documented pattern of contact with board members over the preceding 3 years. The paper trail of Marcus's independent legal consultations. The specific language of the founding charter provision they were planning to invoke, and the counterarguments that had been identified. The protective structural measures Thomas Hargrove had built into the company years earlier, which Gerald confirmed were legally significant and which Clifford and Marcus had, in their planning, evidently overlooked. She also, during this period, began the process of understanding exactly which board members had been influenced by Marcus and to what degree. Adrian had, through careful and entirely legitimate channels, made discreet contact with several board members who had known Thomas Hargrove personally. 2 of them, a woman named Dorothy Payne, who had been on the board since its founding, and a man named Robert Callahan, who had joined 8 years earlier and who had respected Thomas Hargrove enormously, agreed to meet with Adrian in private after she presented them with a carefully structured summary of what had been occurring. Dorothy Payne, when she understood the full picture, was reportedly silent for a long moment and then said, quietly and with considerable precision, "This will be corrected." Robert Callahan used shorter language and was, by Adrian's account, considerably less composed. But both of them were, from that point forward, fully engaged in what was being prepared. Meanwhile, inside Hargrove Capital Group, things were not progressing the way Marcus and Clifford had expected. The uncertainty around Victoria's status had created exactly the legal paralysis that Gerald had predicted. Any significant structural move under the shadow of an unresolved personal situation involving the director carried legal risk that, on advice, even the solicitor Marcus had engaged was counseling caution about. Clifford had moved into the director's role in an acting capacity, which was standard protocol, but the full no-confidence mechanism required a quorum of the full board, and with Dorothy Payne and Robert Callahan suddenly less engaged than they had previously seemed, the votes were not lining up the way Clifford had anticipated. There were delays. There were postponed meetings. There was, increasingly, a quality of tension inside the company that people who worked there noticed, but could not explain. Marcus, for his part, had performed grief publicly in the weeks following Victoria's disappearance. He had spoken to several people in their social circle about how worried he was. He had been seen looking drawn and distracted at a function. He had made some calls to Victoria's contacts asking if anyone had heard from her, calls that were plausible enough on the surface, but that Adrian, who was made aware of them, recognized as the dual-purpose kind. Covering tracks while reinforcing a story. In truth, Marcus's legal team had advised him to hold the marital asset proceedings in abeyance until the situation clarified. And in that holding pattern, weeks became months, and the window Marcus had engineered with such precision was staying stubbornly, inexplicably open. Nothing was closing. Nothing was resolving. And in a plan that had depended on speed, the absence of resolution was itself a form of failure. Victoria watched all of this from the cottage. She watched it through the careful, filtered briefings Adrian provided every 72 hours. She felt the strange, almost dissociative experience of observing her own life from outside it. of reading about the management of Hargrove Capital Group as though it were a company she had no connection to, while simultaneously knowing every room in those offices, every client on those files, every structural detail of the organization down to its foundations. She felt the distance and the closeness simultaneously. And she kept working, because by the time she returned, she intended to walk in with something that could not be contested. The timing of Victoria's return was determined not by emotion but by law. Gerald Whitmore identified the specific moment at which the legal case against Marcus and Clifford was sufficiently complete and sufficiently protected to withstand any immediate counteraction. The moment at which, if they chose to litigate, every document, every testimony, every traced financial record would be available and ready. He also identified the specific board meeting at which Clifford was making his final attempt to formalize his position. A meeting that had been scheduled, delayed twice, and finally set for a Thursday morning in late spring. That was the morning Victoria chose. She arrived at the offices of Hargrove Capital Group at 8:47 in the morning on a Thursday. She came through the main entrance. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit she had left in storage at Adrienne's office. She had her access card, which had never been deactivated because Clifford, in his acting director capacity, had not taken that step and nobody else had thought to. She walked through the lobby, past a receptionist who had worked for the company for 4 years and who looked up and froze in an expression that Victoria later described, with some warmth, as completely understandable. She took the lift to the 4th floor. She walked down the corridor. She could hear voices from the boardroom before she reached it, and she opened the door. Clifford Beaumont was at the head of the table. He was mid-sentence, presenting something to the assembled board members, when the door opened and he looked up. The expression on his face passed through multiple stages in approximately 3 seconds. Recognition. Disbelief. Something he attempted, very briefly, to arrange into composure. He did not manage it. Around the table, the board members who were present reacted variously. 2 of them, people Marcus had cultivated, went very still in a way that was itself a kind of communication. Dorothy Payne, at the far end of the table, looked at Victoria for a moment and then looked at Clifford with an expression that told the room exactly what she already knew. Robert Callahan said, loudly enough to be heard by everyone present, "Well, that is something." Victoria walked to the head of the table. She placed 3 things in front of her. The first was a bound legal brief, prepared by Gerald Whitmore's firm, setting out in full the documented case against both Clifford Beaumont and Marcus, including the financial trail, the board communications, the charter analysis, and the testimony of 2 board members who had submitted sworn statements. The second was a regulatory filing that Adrienne's office had submitted to the relevant oversight body at 8 that morning, meaning it was already on record and could not be suppressed. And the third was a single sheet of paper, her father's letter. Not because it was a legal document, because she had promised herself, in the cottage, in the early mornings when the case felt enormous and she felt small, that Thomas Hargrove would be in the room when this ended. And he was. Victoria addressed the board directly. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anger or distress. She described, factually and sequentially, what had been discovered, what the legal filing contained, and what the consequences would be if any attempt was made to proceed with either the no-confidence vote or any asset-related proceedings. She then turned to Clifford Beaumont and said, with the specific and unhurried directness of someone who has had months to prepare a single sentence, "Your resignation is effective today, Clifford. If your legal team contacts ours before noon, we can manage the public statement together. If not, the regulatory filing speaks for itself." Clifford resigned that morning. He did not speak during the meeting after Victoria arrived. His solicitor contacted Gerald Whitmore's office at 11:43. By mid-afternoon, a brief and professionally unremarkable statement had been issued describing his departure as a voluntary retirement after a long tenure. It was the kind of statement that said nothing and covered everything, and in the corporate world, everyone who read it understood exactly what it meant. Marcus received his divorce papers that same afternoon. His legal team had been in contact with Adrienne's office as early as 9 in the morning, once the regulatory filing became visible. The marital asset claim was withdrawn. The independent solicitor Marcus had issued a short notice of non-engagement. The various threads of the plan Marcus had spent years constructing unraveled, in legal terms, within approximately 4 hours of the moment Victoria walked through the boardroom door. Victoria has been asked many times what that day felt like. She gives a consistent answer, and it is not the answer people expect. She says it felt quiet, that the thing she had been preparing for and anticipating and working toward for months arrived and felt, in the middle of it, simply like work. Like the work she had always done. Like being the person her father had trained her to be, in the building her father had built, doing the thing she had promised herself she would do. The drama of it, she says, was something she felt much later. On the evening of that day, alone in the office after everyone had gone, sitting at the desk her father had used for 30 years, with his letter on the table in front of her. That is when she felt it. She has not said exactly what she felt, and nobody has pressed her on it. Some things, she has said, belong to you and to the person who is no longer here to see them. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell so you never miss what we bring you next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, which part of Victoria's story hit you hardest? We read every single comment. We will see you in the next one.